Welcome to the Fiscal Assessment Report, May 2020. I'm Sebastian Barnes, the Acting Chair of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, and this report focuses on the fiscal impact of Covid-19. The Fiscal Council is an official body with a mandate to assess the public finances. The Fiscal Assessment Report is the Council's twice-yearly flagship report. It assesses the official forecasts, compliance with the fiscal rules, and the appropriateness of the fiscal stance. This FAR develops 3 scenarios to 2025 to help assess today's fiscal policy decisions. It's based on the Stability Programme update published by the Department of Finance in April 2020. We're also publishing today a report on the assessment of compliance with the domestic budgetary rule. The key messages of this report are as follows. Covid-19 will result in a deep economic downturn in the first half of 2020, with a lasting effect on demand for some years to come. Uncertainty is exceptionally high, both uncertainty about the way the pandemic will play out, but also economic uncertainty about what will happen to the economy as a result. The large-scale policy supports implemented so far by the government are appropriate to tackle the immediate crisis. During the recovery phase, a period of fiscal stimulus, a sizable fiscal stimulus, would be warranted. Some fiscal adjustment, however, is likely to be needed in a new steady state once the economy is recovered, but severe austerity can be avoided. The incoming government will need to make important and difficult decisions about its tax and spending priorities and how to achieve its objectives in this new environment. Strengthening the fiscal framework would help to achieve these objectives. Let me now go back and explain to you the reasoning that lies behind these messages. Covid-19 has had a major negative impact on the Irish economy and internationally, both on activity and employment. The chart on the left shows the output of a model run by the Council Secretariat that tries to nowcast GDP in the short term. It suggests that in the year to April 2020, GDP fell by around 20%, a huge fall and a very quick fall that reflects the impact of the Covid-19 and the confinement measures. Taking that into an annual space suggests that GDP or GNI star in 2020 will be some 16% lower than it was in 2019. And that reflects the fact that after this very sharp slowdown, things should pick up as confinement measures are eased, but they will remain at a much lower level than they have been previously. Looking in terms of the impact on employment, it's been dramatic. Unemployment, which was somewhere around 5% prior to the crisis, has increased rapidly to reach 28%, including those on government support schemes such as the pandemic unemployment payment. This chart goes a little deeper. It shows how rapidly things changed in the early part of the year. Each of these bars is a forecast for the Irish economy taken, and this shows the time order. As time went on, the severity of the crisis became clearer and forecasts got revised down. This chart also shows what's driving that slowdown. The dark blue bars, the middle bars, show the impact of lower consumption. The dark green bars at the bottom show how much investment is dragging things down. There's a small offset at the top from government consumption, and there's no positive impact from trade. So it's really being driven by private sector demand in terms of investment and consumption. You'll also see that the SPU forecasts in the middle are the most negative of all the forecasts here. These forecasts, which were endorsed by the Council as being within a reasonable range of forecasts, were taken in mid-April when the outlook was particularly bleak. However, it's well within the bounds of what may happen. At the same time as the economy was being hit by this strong shock, large-scale policy measures have been deployed by the government. This includes some 2 billion for health, an extra 4.5 billion in terms of income supports and wage subsidies, and some cash support for businesses, adding up to some 7 billion. On top of that, the government has already mobilised or announced 7 billion euros in loan guarantees and investments. These are essential to make sure that firms are able to survive, that individuals have some revenue during the period of confinement when the economy is severely disrupted. As you will see, comparing with the final bar, which was the contingency for disorderly Brexit, this is really a massive deployment of fiscal firepower. Despite these policy measures, Covid-19 will have a lasting impact on the Irish economy. Looking at the chart on the left, you can see underlying domestic demand. The green line shows what it was forecast to be without the impact of COVID-19. So you see continued steady growth. However, due to the COVID-19 shock, you can see this very sharp fall in 2020, some recovery in 2021 as the confinement measures are eased, as the economy bounces back. But the economy nevertheless remains well below the level it would have been had it not been for the COVID-19 crisis for a long time to come. What's important to note, and what a point many people have made, is that Ireland is in much better shape than it was in 2008. Going to 2008, there was a property bubble, there was a credit bubble, the economy was overheating, consumption was too high, and so the correction was extremely painful. It meant that essentially the level of activity and consumption had to go down permanently, and it was accompanied by a financial crisis, and those crises always take a long time to work through. So if you look at it in terms of employment, you will see that that in the financial crisis, it took 11 years for employment to get back to the level it had been at in 2008. However, with the COVID crisis, and looking at a range of estimates, it will probably take about 3 years to get back to that level. So a much quicker recovery, given that the economy went in essentially fairly robust shape. Against this background, uncertainty is very high. The main risks by far are risks around the COVID-19 health outcomes, how the pandemic evolves, how effective distancing turns out to be, whether a vaccine or new treatments become available. And conditional on those impacts, there's also a lot of uncertainty about how the economy will respond. But we shouldn't forget there are other important risks facing Ireland. The first risk is the risk of a hard Brexit. And the chart on the left here shows the impact relative to a baseline of a hard Brexit. So you can see that real GDP growth would fall by perhaps 2.5% or 2% relative to the existing forecasts if this shock were to take place. On the other hand, Ireland also became very reliant on corporation tax revenue from multinational companies in the last few years. Looking at the chart on the right, you can see that almost 1/5 of government revenues on an exchequer basis was coming from corporation tax. And this is not only important for the government, and it sustains a lot of spending, but it's also important for the economy, because this is a net injection of funds coming into Ireland. So if it were to go, there would be a double hit on the public finances and on the economy. To make sense of this uncertainty and to help the government and citizens understand what may be coming in the next few years, the Council decided to develop in this report 3 scenarios to 2025. The SPU includes a forecast to 2021, but here we extend it further because fiscal decisions should really be taken over a longer period, and give 3 different scenarios given how high that the uncertainty is. Taking the central scenario, this begins with the SPU 2020 forecast, so the official forecast and stability programme, which assume a sharp contraction followed by a protracted recovery. We also consider a mild scenario where the recovery is faster, containment measures are successful, maybe they can be lifted a little bit faster, the damage to the economy is less than the SPU assumes, and so things get back on track quicker. But we also consider a severe scenario. Here the confinement and related measures are less successful. They're repeated lockdowns. We get into the, people often talk about the second wave, and this causes financial distress and renewed periods of confinement that you can see marked here. This gives us a fair range, it doesn't cover all possibilities, but a fair range of outcomes that could happen over the next 5 years. In terms of the economic paths that result from these scenarios, you see there's a very wide range of different outcomes, which are represented by these lines. In terms of the period it takes to recover to the level in 2019, you see that varies between about a year in the mild scenario to over 3 years in the severe scenario. So we're looking at a recovery that would take 1 to 3 years. In no case do we get back to the counterfactual of what would have been the case had there not been COVID, but in the mild scenario, we get quite close by 2023. What's important to note as well is that compared to the financial crisis, that the early stages of COVID are actually worse than the financial crisis in all the scenarios. By 2023, all of the scenarios are far above the level that was reached at the same point of the financial crisis. In terms of the public finances, this hard economic impact of COVID will have very significant implications. Spending will increase significantly, and that's partly a result of the measures that we've seen already, that the policy measures that were introduced, but also from higher unemployment payments. But even bigger will be the sharp fall in revenue as the economy slows. In fact, the Department of Finance forecasts a 15 billion euro fall in revenue this year alone. There's some pickup next year. Spending is assumed to come back a bit, and revenues are expected to increase as the economy recovers. But you can see a large gap, and this is essentially the deficit opens up between the two. And in terms of spending, this assumes only the spending plans that have been currently announced. So there's a lot of upside risk here in the sense that if existing supports are extended, or for example, through the economic recovery plan, spending could be much higher than this. However, what's very important to understand what's happened to the public finances is that interest rates have also fallen quite sharply since the COVID crisis, in part due to the actions of the ECB. And Ireland's also benefiting from a favourable tailwind because new debt that's issued, it's issued at lower interest rates than a few years back when debt was being first issued. And so you can actually see that in the council central scenario, despite the fact that debt and the deficit are going to be quite a lot higher, interest payments actually broadly the same as they were forecast to be in budget 2020, and even fall a little bit in the outer years. However, despite the favourable interest rate background, the deficit will widen in all scenarios, and it will remain significant by 2025. If you take the central scenario, by 2025, despite the recovery, we're still looking at a deficit that's just a little bit shy of 3%. In the mild scenario, it's a little bit less, and in the severe scenario, it's somewhat higher. So what does this mean in terms of policy? What is the appropriate fiscal stance for the period to come? Well, this will very much depend on which scenario we're in, how the economy evolves, how COVID evolves, and many other things. But it's helpful to think, I think, in terms of 3 different phases. And in each phase, different policy advice would apply. In the first phase, that's where we are now, we're still subject to confinement restrictions. The economy is very disrupted, and so we face this immediate crisis. In the second phase, confinement measures will have eased, and on the medical side, things will be more like normal. But still, demand will be much lower in the economy because consumption will be very weak, savings are likely to remain very high, investment is likely to remain very weak, and as a result, unemployment will be very high. So phase 2 is the recovery phase, and that has implications for policy. And in the third phase, once the economy is recovered, once we're back to some kind of new normal level, wherever that may be, different policy considerations will come to the fore. In terms of phase 1, the Council judges that the actions taken so far by the government to tackle the immediate crisis have been appropriate. Now, it's important that those measures should stay in place as long as they're needed. And it would be a mistake, indeed counterproductive, to take them back too quickly because that would risk harming the economy. However, it may be necessary for those measures to evolve, in part as needs change. For example, some sectors may be subject to lockdown longer than others, and also maybe lessons could be learned about the design of those policies. During the second phase, during the recovery phase, a sizable fiscal stimulus is needed to support economic activity. The chart on the left shows the Council's measure of the output gap. The output gap shows how much slack there is in the economy when it's in negative territory below the line. And you can see that even as 2020 things improve from 2020, sizable output gap and spare capacity will remain. This is why fiscal stimulus would be important. It would help to bring demand back to what the economy is capable of producing. The chart on the right shows what a 10 billion euro stimulus would look like. This is just an indicative figure, but it gives a sense of what a large, sizable stimulus may be. It's just for illustration, and the actual size would have to be decided closer to the time when it was more clearer what was happening in the economy. You can see that a 10 billion euro stimulus corresponds to a 6% of GNI star stimulus. This would boost GNI star by about 3%. It would lead to a worse budget balance, and it would lead to higher debt. But these things would be worth doing because they would help to close this gap in demand, they would help to reduce unemployment, and they would help to ensure that the economy recovers as it should. It's very important that stimulus measures should be timely, they should be targeted, and in particular, they should be designed to be temporary. So when they're no longer needed, they can easily be withdrawn. A key part of any stimulus package should be public investment. In the 2008-2009 crisis, as you can see from this chart, public investment was cut back very sharply. It was then kept at a very low level for a prolonged period, and the consequences of that and some of the costs have been very clear in recent years. Public investment is a very helpful tool in the stimulus package. Certain forms of public investment are very powerful in terms of the jobs they create and the activity they can support. And at the same time, public investment, putting money into public investment rather than to current consumption, means that the state will be building up its assets for the future, building up the productive capacity of the economy. And so it will be important to keep public investment at least at the kind of levels that they were in 2019, though of course it may be necessary to reprioritize things as situations change, and also to make sure that projects can be implemented on time. By 2021, the government debt to GNI star ratio could be in the range of 115 to 160% of GDP. And we can see on the left-hand side how this varies across the scenarios. In the central scenario, it's somewhere around 120%. In the mild scenario, it actually comes down, but in the central and the severe scenarios, debt to GNI ratios stay at that very high level at 2025. We don't naturally come back to a downward path for these ratios. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see this in historical perspective, that the debt to GNI star ratio is, particularly in the more severe scenarios, is going to be somewhere near historical highs. With such high debt to GNI star ratios, with such high public debt, Ireland will be vulnerable to shocks to interest rates, if interest rates go up, if growth disappoints, if there's another crisis of the sort that we've seen during the Covid-19 crisis. So it will be very important at this point to reduce that vulnerability by putting debt down on a downward path relative to GNI star. At the same time, measures will be needed to close the gap between revenue and spending. This chart shows revenue and expenditure over the next 5 years in the central scenario. As you can see, after the dip, revenue does recover, but there's a permanent gap opens up in the central scenario for around 6 billion euros a year between revenue and expenditure. This gap will have to be closed to help put debt to GNI star back on the downward path it needs to be to bring it back to safer levels. Another thing that's interesting about this chart is if you look at the stimulus part, a temporary stimulus spread over a couple of years does not make a huge difference to this picture in the long run. So you can do stimulus, and of course that will have to be withdrawn, but it doesn't fundamentally change the debt dynamics in a big way. So there's some headroom to do stimulus. So some fiscal adjustment will be needed, in particular with this focus to put the debt to GNI star on a downward path. This chart shows some estimates of the fiscal adjustment that's required relative to a business as usual scenario to put debt to GNI star back onto a path of an annual reduction of 3 percentage points by 2025. This would have debt decreasing at the same rate as it did in 2019, but of course from a much higher level. What I think is reassuring about this chart is that while the range of adjustments varies quite a lot from 6 billion in the mild scenario to 14 billion in the severe scenario and 10 billion in the central scenario, it's far, far less than it was during the financial crisis. Even in the severe scenario, it's half what was required in the financial crisis, and in the baseline, it's a third. So this is a very different picture from the one that people remember from 2008. At the same time, this means that this adjustment should be more gradual. For example, in the central scenario, this will require an adjustment of 2 or 3 billion euros per year over a three-year period. It should take place in phase 3 against a much more positive economic backdrop than was the case during the crisis, which will make it less costly. And the kind of measures needed to achieve this adjustment are far less dramatic, far less disruptive than the kind of thing that was seen after the financial crisis. So it won't be an easy background for the public finances. It may be that taxes need to increase. It may be that spending either needs to be frozen or to be cut, but it's a very different picture, a very different story, and severe austerity should be avoided here. The next government, however, will face difficult decisions about competing tax and spending objectives. With fiscal adjustment in the background, which already requires some action just to put debt back onto a safer path, any new initiatives will need to be financed either by spending less, by productivity gains, by reducing costs, or through raising taxes. The two parties discussing a coalition agreement have set ambitious objectives in terms of the implementation of Schloonschecare, investing in housing and climate change measures. These things are all feasible, but they must be funded sustainably, and that's likely to require these adjustments in other parts of spending or to raise taxes. A further contribution to this medium-term stability would be to strengthen the fiscal framework. The Council assesses in this report that the fiscal rules were complied with in 2019. For 2020, domestic and EU rules both very sensibly allow flexibility for exceptional circumstances that clearly apply now. So this isn't an obstacle to government support measures today. This could be extended into 2021 and could help provide some fiscal space for the stimulus package that the Council believes will be necessary at this point in time. There's also some measures that can help to strengthen the fiscal framework. These can both help to achieve the fiscal adjustment that's needed and also to make sure that Ireland maintains its fiscal creditworthiness. These include having more credible debt ratio targets, which will be very important when debt's at a very high level, enhancing the rainy day fund, which has been useful but in this crisis but was very small, and in terms of improving medium-term budgeting to help planning, to help prioritization, and also to help achieve the necessary fiscal adjustment. So let me conclude with the key messages of this report. COVID-19 will result in a deep economic downturn in the first half of this year, and that will have a lasting effect. Uncertainty, both medical and economic, is exceptionally high. Large-scale policy supports that have been implemented so far are warranted and appropriate to tackle immediate crisis and should be kept in place as long as required, although it may need to be adjusted in their exact form. During the second phase, during the recovery phase, a sizable fiscal stimulus would be warranted. This would likely last over multiple years and be a multi-billion euro package. In the third phase, once the economy has reached a new normal, however, the high level of debt will become a greater concern. Some fiscal adjustment is likely to be needed, but severe austerity can be avoided. The incoming government will face difficult decisions about tax and spending priorities, both because of the fiscal adjustment, but also because of the ambitious objectives they've set themselves. This will almost certainly require adjustments in other parts of spending, but also potentially increases in taxation. Strengthening the fiscal framework would help this process. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. Thank you.